few weeks ago, I got a comment asking me to talk about the ethics of fashion rental, something I advocate a lot for on my channel and something I do a lot in my personal life. Like a lot of things in life, the debate around renting your wardrobe is a little bit more nuanced than it's 100% good or it's 100% bad. So in today's video, I want to take a deeper look into a service that's being presented as a potential solution and way forward for fashion, and discuss why this may or may not be the case. I'm also going to include a snippet of my conversation with byeee CEO Eshita Kabra Davies, which I'm going to be releasing in full on my podcast. We have a lot to cover, like always, so let's get into it. So if you're not aware, rental platforms like byeee, hiii, Rent the Runway, and others have been around for a while. It's not a new concept, but they've traditionally struggled to monetize and grow their business. However, 2024 is proving that this may no longer be the case. Rent the Runway, which is a well-known, well-established brand, hopes to have its first break-even year this year in 15 years of doing business. Platforms are increasingly coming out with new partnerships and services to make renting increasingly frictionless. And brands are jumping at the opportunity to get in on the rental market, not only because it's great sustainability credentials, but because it's quite a lucrative offering if they can get it right. Other industry context you might want to know is that many platforms are trying to expand their business and make renting more of an everyday thing rather than something that's done only for occasions. And to do this, many of them are introducing subscriptions to entice people to rent more of their wardrobe. Rental has definitely exploded in popularity since the pandemic, and that's for a couple of reasons. One of the biggest ones is our changing relationship to owning things. There's a great quote from Victoria Prue, who is the CEO of hiii Fashion Rental. In an interview, she basically summed it up as, "We've reached peak stuff. People now want access to things over ownership." And a lot of those ideas came during the pandemic when we were all trapped inside our homes and we had time to evaluate how much we owned and how a lot of it wasn't necessary. There's been recent studies that have looked at how society is currently going through macro trends of collaborative consumption and a sharing economy, which business models like fashion rental fit into and has increased their popularity. I think we also have to thank the boom in fashion rental to the work from brands and from fashion influencers maybe of making the stigma around fashion rental go away. I reference it a lot on my channel, but the catchphrase "thanks it's rented" was seen as a social badge of honor at one point and quite provocative for people to acknowledge the fact that they were renting their clothes on their Instagram feed and not just pretend they'd bought clothing from designers. Not only have these social aspects contributed to the increase in rental, you also have the economic benefits, which are obviously very welcome in today's economy. A study found that 70% of UK consumers recognize the financial benefit of circular practices in fashion, like renting. The affordability of renting has meant that a large portion of rental platforms' customer base is younger generations, looking for access to those luxury items that they can't afford right now, but want to be seen as having. Gen Z is also pioneering the access over ownership model. They are much more likely to accept experiences where they are renting and holding onto something for only a short amount of time versus older generations who are much more used to buying something and seeing it in their wardrobe and wearing it when they want, so maybe less likely to accept renting so easily. Of course, Gen Z is a generation that's grown up with other access industries like Airbnb, like Uber. The idea of renting our wardrobes is pretty normal to us, just like we would rent an apartment for a week. But across all generations, the attitude behavior gap is still an issue. A lot of us say we care about sustainability, but often we don't act on those sustainable instincts when it comes to actually buying something for a number of reasons. So now we've got the wider industry and social context out the way, let's move on to some of the pros and cons of fashion rental. One of the biggest pros, and something I think has led to fashion rental being a lot more desirable, is people realizing how much money they can get from renting their clothes. There's been so many articles I've seen online of headlines saying, I made thousands of pounds renting my clothes out to strangers, or this is how I make an extra £500 a month. And what I think is interesting is the fact that financial incentives like making extra money from renting out your wardrobe is a much easier way to break the barrier and stigma around renting than just a sustainability initiative. Because as much as a lot of us care about the environment, we are all struggling with the cost of living right now. And having rental be seen as a way of making extra money is a way of appealing to maybe a wider market, or a way of fixing that attitude behavior gap. Because for a lot of us, the issue is that we can't see very tangible results from our actions, since, they're small steps towards sustainability and we have a long way to go. But this is a very tangible action. You rent out your wardrobe and you get money into your wallet, which you can do whatever you want with. And I think that's really interesting. Another pro for rental is that it's a great way of skipping out on something that could otherwise be really wasteful. And I'm thinking specifically of like children's clothes, or like a ski vacation that you're only going to take once every 4 years and you don't need a whole wardrobe for. Or even a special event like a wedding. You maybe want to rent your bridesmaids dresses or your actual wedding dress, since those things probably wouldn't be worn again. I think a slightly more niche pro that I thought of when I was thinking about this video is rental as a solution to the influencer industry, where a lot of popular creators buy clothes, take pictures in them, and then return them to stores. And those returns aren't properly processed and often just end up getting thrown away rather than back into the store's inventory system. I don't know if rental is an absolute solution to this. For one thing, it might perpetuate the cycle of newness if influencers aren't being upfront about the fact that these clothes are rented. This could be a great solution, obviously, if they're being upfront about it. One of the better known pros for renting is it's a very affordable and accessible way of renting clothes and accessories that may otherwise be out of your price budget. Funny enough, when I was scripting this video, I was going to use the example of a Birkin bag, which is notoriously hard to get your hands on, but is available on some rental sites. I say funny enough because right now there's a story in the UK papers exactly about this, saying that if you can't afford a £10,000 bag outright, you can rent one for £150 a day. I mean, obviously that's still a lot of money, but if you particularly want to use this bag for your outfit, then it's definitely a more affordable option. There are other slightly less eye-watering examples, like this Coach bag I found that retails at close to £500, but you can rent for £47 for 4 days. Plus, this isn't exactly an everyday bag, I'd say. Obviously, it depends what bag you're going to go for. But if you wanted to have an ostentatious bag for New Year's Eve, for example, one that's covered in feathers and sequins, and probably something you're not going to use every day, then renting it is a really great option for that. You can experiment without having to buy something and then leave it in the back of your wardrobe. And that kind of brings me on to my main pro argument, which is that rental can help people transitioning from a fast fashion mindset into something slower but closer to what they're used to than going cold turkey. I've talked a lot on my channel about how hard it was to break from the fast fashion mindset. And there's a lot of research to suggest that shaming people for their fast fashion habits is not always the best approach. Psychology shows that when we're called out for something, it forces us into a defense mode. And it makes us less likely to hear people's arguments about why what we're doing is a bad thing. It also doesn't tackle the root of the behavior of why we're doing this in the first place. I mentioned that I interviewed the CEO of Byeee, Eshita Kabra Davies, and she had some really interesting things to say about why people turn to fast fashion in the first place.
Brat summer, all of that. You see people kind of, dabbling in these trends, not really knowing if they're right for them. So therefore they turn to fast fashion because they find it so accessible when it comes to price. And it's built for throwing away. I mean, that's what, a lot of these fast fashion giants, the ultra fast fashion giants, you to only wear the item once or twice and then throw it away. I think you're right. It doesn't fully take away this idea that, we have enough and we don't need it anymore. We love all these sort of things where something feels new and shiny and different and unique to what we've been having all along. And I just think that the way that you can experience a new, like a new hit to your fashion and style doesn't need to be through purchasing something completely new and firsthand. It can be secondhand and it could actually be sitting in someone else's wardrobe. So I just think it's a different way of approaching this animal instinct, this human issue that we will always have, by making it much more circular.
I think it's definitely a mistake to ignore that psychology in us that craves newness. When I was researching for this video, I came across a quote by Caroline Mayer, behavioral psychologist and author of The Psychology of Fashion. She said that fashion thrives on our need for novelty, and so renting, which is new to us, but obviously not new clothing, satisfies that need without us needing to go out and buy something ourselves. I'm going to talk more about this argument in the cons part of this video, but last point I want to bring up for the pros is that rental has got a lot more plus size friendly since it started. It's by no means perfect, don't get me wrong, but there are now rental platforms dedicated to plus size clothing, and other mainstream platforms are trying to improve their size offerings. A couple of years ago, I actually interviewed the CEO of hiii, Victoria Prue, about how hiii has tried to increase their plus sizes. And they definitely had made some progress a few years ago. But this doesn't mean we don't still need to keep an eye on whether brands are continuing that initial progress. With the rise of weight loss drugs changing the demand for plus size fashion, I could see how brands could quickly forget about these promises towards plus size inclusivity and focus more on slimmer fashion, saying that it's due to this demand. I know I just said that fashion rental is improving in plus size, but I think there's a couple of ways they are missing out. I very much found a lack of accessible clothing on the platforms that I was looking on. And I could see how for differently abled people, renting might not be an option. Although I did try research some platforms offering accessible fashion, I couldn't find any. So I'd be really happy if you could link any you know in the comments. Okay, let's go on to the cons of fashion rental. Starting with the biggest one, which is the promotion of the trend cycle. Like Caroline Mayer said, fashion thrives on newness, and rental platforms are not immune to dipping into the trend cycle in order to get people renting more. I've seen a lot of them do edits for trends, and although, they're not buying that clothing, it's still perpetuating the trend cycle. I found quite an interesting argument online which looked at the access over ownership model as a perpetuator of the trend cycle. Basically, they argued that because people were renting clothing, they didn't have to worry about fitting that clothing into their wardrobe as they would if they were buying it. And therefore, people would cycle through the clothing more often because you have no reason to keep renting the same thing unless you absolutely loved it. And it pushes platforms to keep offering new things if they want to keep customers engaged. They sort of summed it up by saying that with fashion rental, the use of each item may be increased because more people are renting it, but more styles would be needed to satisfy this increased demand for newness. And I think that's really interesting. For one thing, I think it's interesting how this could be different for peer-to-peer rental platforms versus managed. If it's a person rather than a brand listing clothes, then are they going to be less aware or less likely to care about this demand for newness for their customers? And would the platform managing this peer-to-peer rental service be more focused on encouraging more people to rent their clothing and therefore have access to whole new wardrobes of style versus managed platforms which will be pushing brands to create more so they have more to put on their websites? And I'm not saying that's the case necessarily, but I think it's an interesting concept. I think this is a pretty big issue if it's not addressed by fashion rental. And I think the potential solution is platforms encouraging a mindset shift for their customers. Because if consumers care less about newness, then they won't be demanding that newness from rental platforms. The psychology of wanting to have something new all the time is something we need to be aware of so we can tackle it, so we can be mindful about it. Because like Carolyn Mayer, the psychologist, said, fashion rental offers access to something that is not necessarily new, but it is new to us. And thereby we can satisfy that craving for newness in a more sustainable way. What's interesting is that when I spoke to Eshita about how fashion rental can perpetuate our need for newness, she agreed. But she also mentioned something that really got me thinking.
We're really seeing a shift in people kind of renting for longer periods and styling the same item that they've rented in multiple different ways. People renting different kind of stylish looks for work appropriate outfits. It's been really interesting kind of seeing the journey since we're 5 years old now, of the early days where, it was all about renting a very specific statement piece. And now it's kind of moved on to people actually renting items to try them before they actually invest and buy in them.
I wanted to specifically address two of the things mentioned in the comment from the beginning of the video. And one of those was what happens to the rental clothing at the end of their lives. The commenters said that they often see clothing from rental platforms flood resale sites after they've been used. And I want to talk about that a bit more. This obviously differs when you're talking about managed rental versus peer-to-peer. But I think what we need to remember for both of them is that they've most likely been worn a lot more times than they would have been if they weren't rented. My Wardrobe HQ estimates that items put onto their platform are worn 15 times more than items that aren't. And one of the things I immediately thought when reading this statistic is if that item hadn't been offered as an option to rent, would 15 people have gone out and bought it and then listed it on a resale platform once they're done, and it would have completely flooded the market even more? I think rental platforms do a really good job of trying to extend the life cycle of clothing once it's finished with its rental journey. So a lot of platforms offer people the choice to buy something after they've rented it and decided they love it for a very discounted price, because obviously you're buying something that's been worn by a lot of people. A lot of platforms also host sales for their community where they can come and see clothing that is no longer going to be available on the rental site and get that for a discount too. Another part of the comment was about the environmental impact of shipping rental fashion. And yes, this is definitely a downside to rental, but I think we need to look at some further context. If you look at the emissions from transporting clothing versus making something new, it's clear which one is worse. Doing some quick research and going off the emissions average for creating a dress versus shipping a parcel in the UK, it's 100 times more polluting to do the former. Not only that, a lot of platforms do offer alternatives to try and mitigate these emissions in the first place. Some companies, like By Rotation, encourage people to meet up with people in the local area if possible, which obviously means you don't have to ship it across long distances. Others work with green courier services, at least here in the UK, which depend on a large majority of electric vehicles to cut down those emissions. And the other thing I thought of was the fact that a lot of these platforms are introducing subscription services and schemes where you can rent multiple things at once and send them all back together. For example, Five by Higher Street allows you to rent 5 items for a whole month and they're delivered and returned together. So you're only doing one journey versus 5. Okay, I think to sum it up, at least in my mind, I've come away from this research and making this video thinking that the pros of fashion rental outweigh the cons. But what I think is really important to remember is that fashion rental may be seen as an alternative to fast fashion addiction, but it's not a solution to that craving for newness, which is so ingrained in our DNA and something we have to be conscious of all the time when it comes to fashion. Until we as a society have a mindset shift towards fashion, then I don't think this hunger for newness is going to have a solution. But fashion rental in the meantime could bridge that gap. although it still has a lot of work to do to become more accessible and inclusive. And we need to keep reminding brands of the importance of this. Anyway, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I'd love to hear any and all thoughts you have, whether you agree, whether you disagree. Let's make this a discussion on fashion rental. And like I said, I'll be releasing the full interview with Eshita in the coming days. So make sure you're subscribed to my podcast Refashioned so you know when that drops. Have a lovely day and I'll speak to you really soon. Bye.